What's up, everybody? Welcome back. This is Bob from Garage Dwellers Woodworking. Today we are going to be doing part 2 of our Outfeed assembly bench build. Now in part 1 we did our side systainer cabinets. Those are all wrapped up. So for part 2 today we are covering the central portion of the base of the table. It's going to be a little bit of cabinetry, a little bit of shelf making, plywood cutting. We're going to use pocket holes instead of dominoes this time. And I'm going to show you how I did these drawers. So thanks for coming. Check it out. So we left off last time having finished up 2 of these systainer cabinets that define the 2 sides of the base of this Outfeed assembly bench. And the next step was going to be drilling a bunch of pocket holes. Now, this is again something that I was doing very custom, so I didn't have set definite lengths and widths necessarily in mind, except knowing what I wanted out of the overall dimensions of the base. So after drilling some pocket holes in some of my pre-cut material, you can see there I had used a 90-degree clamp to set one of the sides up against the edge, and I'm now building out the bases of what is going to be the front of this cabinet. The front of the cabinet is going to have 2 bays in it. On the left bay we're going to have drawers, and on the right side there's going to be 1 drawer as well as space for things like a foot pedal for a vacuum pump as well as a dust extractor. So with all of this, I was either using pocket holes or glue and screws. You can see here, glued up the edges, made sure everything was nice and flush and square, and was gluing and screwing in the side pieces for this portion of the cabinet. Now the piece of plywood that's laying against the table saw currently is what is going to be the back of this section of front cabinets, and I cut this a little bit long because again, I just wanted to make sure that I could get these 2 bays very evenly divided. And what I'm doing here is I've glued in the bottom portion of the cabinet, and I'm using the piece that is going to be the bottom of the other side of the cabinet along the top so that I've got nice even spacing so that I can guarantee as I glue and screw this divider piece in that I've got a nice square even set of cabinets, and this is perfectly split right down the middle. Both sides of the cabinet are going to be the same width. Now you'll notice throughout this build that I'm using these 90-degree clamping squares, and I gotta tell you, these things are tremendously helpful. There are some out there that are more expensive. You'll find some that are cheaper. These are woodpeckers. Notice these are not the anodized red. This is a little bit of a cheaper version that they also sell that you just have to use some extra clamps to clamp down. But especially I found with cabinet building, these things are really helpful. They make great tools to make sure everything is square and help a lot with holding your workpiece. So as you can see here, I've got the divider in place using those 90-degree clamping squares to help hold things up. Glue, screws, some pocket holes here, and this thing is going to be nicely attached. It's going to be nice and square, and it's perfectly dividing down the center. Now I mentioned I left it a little bit long just because I wanted to make sure these cabinets were built perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and use the track saw here just to cut this almost to completely flush and then bust out the trim router. You saw me do this in part 1 of the build, which if you haven't seen, definitely recommend you go and check that out. I'm going to go ahead and make a playlist that has the entire build for this entire workbench Outfeed table monstrosity. You saw me do that at the end, and this is one of those building tricks that I found more and more as I go along. I like to cut things a little bit long and not cut them to final width until I'm really ready to be done with the piece. So here you can see I added some stretchers with some pocket holes for a little support along the top to help keep things square, and the front of the cabinet for the base here is basically done. So it's on to working on the back section of the cabinet. Now the back section of the cabinet is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be the section that is going to be facing my table saw, and so to access this, it's going to generally be stuff that I don't use as much because to get to it I have to pull the table saw out to get to it. There's going to be a long shelf in the top portion of this cabinet that's going to hold my Lee dovetail jig, and then I'm going to have 2 compartments in the bottom that are going to be storage for some cables and some hoses passing through, as well as storage for a vacuum pump. So you've seen here, just like in the last video, using the track saw, using my table saw to get my plywood cut down, and if you do use a track saw, I'd really highly recommend one of these 90-degree edges. Makes breakdown just a lot simpler. Now, you may be wondering how in a couple of these scenes, there was one of these in part one of the build series for this as well, how I'm not cutting into my tabletop. I'm using some Rockler bench cookies to set it up off the table, and then with the track saw, I can set a pretty exact depth. That way I make sure that I don't make any mistakes, but obviously I'd much rather be doing this on a table, where if I do screw something up, it won't be quite as bad. So here, once again, I'm utilizing my 90-degree clamping squares to go ahead and get the sides and bottom portion of the back section of these cabinets done. Again, pocket holes, glue and screws, and getting all this in is turning out pretty simple. Now, once I've got that in, the next step is going to be the center divider for this back portion of cabinets. And of course, like I mentioned, I need these to be a little bit different than the front in that I want one long storage shelf on the top of these cabinets, and then the bottom is two separate little cubbies. So here you can see I'm taking a piece that I had previously gotten some pocket holes done, and I'm cutting it down to the appropriate width and depth that I'm going to need for this section. Again, the goal here is to make two complementary cubbies that are on the bottom of this portion of cabinets with a shelf on the top that can hold this wide jig. Now, of course, somehow I lost the footage for this portion of the build, but we can explain it pretty easily. You can see that center divider there defines my two base cubbies, and then we'll just put a shelf in between the two side panels, and that is where my dovetail jig is going to sit. Give you a nice slow-mo shot here just so that you can focus on things, make sure my gut's in view. Yeah, there it is. We're good to go. And what you can see here in the final shot, there's that shelf with my dovetail jig as well as my collapsible spray booth. And then you see the two bottom cubbies. You can see how this is butted right up against the table saw. And now you can see everything put together in its final form, kind of in the middle here. Here's my front two cabinets, the dust extractor there. So now that I've got this center section of the cabinets built, it's time to put everything together. And what I care about most here is that the front face, where the drawers are going to be, and the top of the systainer side cabinets, and then the central bank of drawers and cabinets and everything line up. If the bottom is a little bit off, that's not a big deal. I'm going to be putting leveling feet on this thing, but I want a nice flat top and a nice flush front. So now that I've got some shims under these side systainer cabinets, I'm going ahead and just using some screws to start drilling everything in the middle cabinet into the side systainer cabinets so that we've got some structure and rigidity. Obviously, I'm not gluing any of this. This is all just screws holding it together. I can break things down later if I need. Now here, just to get, again, a little bit more support, what I'm doing is marking where the dividers are in my systainer cabinets and then scribing a couple lines so that I can throw some screws directly into the back of those. Figuring, again, that'll give me some more rigidity. You can see I put 3 or 4 screws along the top, bottom, and middle section everywhere in this middle cabinet, as well as putting it into those dividers in my systainer cabinets. Now, once I had that done, I went ahead and got the entire unit tipped up onto its side and started working on some feet. Now, one of the things in the design of this that's really important to me is the fact that my current table saw is about 1.5 inches higher than the saw that I know at some point in the next 1 to 1.5 years I'm going to get. I'm going to be getting a saw stop at some point here for obvious safety reasons and for a little bit of a power upgrade from what I have. So I wanted to make sure that this thing was flexible. I didn't want to have to go back and cut cabinets down or anything. So as part of the build, I had to factor all that into account. But of course, I wanted some leveling feet. So I took some hardwood, just took some scrap cherry that I had, made 6 feet that got put in 2 spots, front and back, on each of the sides, as well as the middle section. And then we got our leveling feet screwed in. Next up, once I got that all done, it's time to build some drawers. And of course, building drawers, I'm just using some of the 3/4 inch plywood I had left over. You could absolutely use 1/2 inch here if you wanted to, but for my shop stuff, I like these beefy 3/4 inch drawers. So the first part of the drawers that I'm making are the side pieces of the drawers, and that's because I know the exact depth of everything that I want. I'm going to use the miter gauge here, and to start with, I'm going to go ahead and take all those side pieces I cut and get a perfect 90-degree edge on them. I've gone ahead and set my flip stop to the width that I need that'll set the depth. Go ahead and put the piece of plywood up against that. I always like this method of setting it up, kind of pulling it back and setting it in. That way I've got constant pressure on it, and I do the same one for each piece. and I go ahead and cut the width of these off. At this point, it's all a matter of batching these out. I always double check after that first cut, and my depth was good to go. I was happy with how everything looked, so we can go ahead and proceed and batch all of this stuff out. Now, once I had gone ahead and gotten all those side pieces cut out, the next thing I do in my drawer building process is I install the drawer slides. And one of my favorite things to do is to determine the distance that I want between my drawer slides and my drawers, and then get a bunch of 1/4-inch plywood cutoffs and tape them to the side of the wall. And this sets a very specific and repeatable distance in between each drawer slide. It also has the advantage of holding them up, so I don't have to worry about installing them parallel to the base of the cabinet. I then use a combo square to go ahead and set the depth of my cabinet faces. Now, next thing I need to do is build the front and the back portion of all of my drawers. Obviously, those are going to be sandwiched in between the two side pieces because you're pulling on that front face all the time. And what I'm using here is the Woodpecker's modular bar gauge system. There's cheaper ways to do this, but I love these tools, and I love this tool in particular. It makes things super accurate. I clamp 2 cutoff pieces from my plywood to mimic the thickness of the 2 sides of the drawer, and I then use the bar gauge to measure the width. Now, it's nice here because I don't have to worry about, well, is it, 20 and 5/16 or 20 and whatever. I just use this bar gauge, I take it over to the table saw, go to the miter gauge, get everything all set up, and I can make really accurate, repeatable cuts with this. So same process, we're squaring up one edge, and then we're gonna flip it over, flip our flip stop down, and then go ahead and cut to width. And of course, once I do this, I'm gonna check to make sure that it is the measurement that I got when I measured, so I've always got kind of a backup process. We are good to go. Now the next step is cutting grooves for my 1/4-inch plywood panel that will be the bottom of each drawer. I take a standard kerf saw blade and I do 2 passes with this just so I can get a nice exact fit. I find with the dado stack I don't always get an exact fit. Now what I'm doing here is the way that I like to build drawers personally is the back panel of the drawer. I like to cut so that it's flush with the top of that groove for the bottom panel of the drawer. And what this allows me to do, as you can see here, it's nice and flush. When I assemble the drawers, I can just go ahead and assemble them without having to worry about getting the panel in there. I can glue them up, move on to other parts of the project. As you can see here, I go ahead and glue my drawer boxes up before I've even put that panel in because of how I'm making these drawers. And what you'll see later is I can then later insert that bottom panel and go ahead and screw it into that back part of the drawer. I find it adds a little bit of rigidity to that bottom panel in the sense that you don't get as much racking around. Now here I'm checking for square, and always check to make sure. Sometimes you've over clamped, you've put too much pressure in one spot, and I had a little bit of a gap and I knew I was off just a hair there. I tried squeezing it back in, but that wasn't working. So again, these 90-degree clamping squares are just fantastic, and especially if you're a beginner woodworker, someone just starting out, grab some of these. They are a great investment and they make your life so much easier. So I took some of the scrap 1/4-inch plywood that I had laying around the shop and went ahead and cut all of my bottom panels for the drawers, and as you can see, it's flush with the back. Happy with the result there, so I'm going to go ahead and screw some holes here. I always like to pre-drill for my screws. There's self-tapping stuff, but especially with 1/4-inch plywood, I'd just rather not have something split, so I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill and countersink for some screws here. We plop some screws in. There's no glue at all in this process. One of the things that I like about this especially is if something happens to this bottom panel in the future, I don't have to rebuild an entire drawer. I can just take these screws out, I can pull this panel, cut a new panel, put it back in, so it makes everything nice for fixing anything that may happen in the future. And voila, we have a bunch of drawers. So the next step is going to be putting on our drawer guides for my drawer slides. I'm using a combination square again here that I know is the distance that I need from the bottom of the drawer to this. And I'm also using a flat surface here on the front just to make sure that that front portion of the drawer slide is nice and flush with the face. Now again, I mentioned this earlier, but you notice construction-wise, the front panel of the drawer always goes into the sides. You don't want your sides being joined into the front because again, you're going to be pulling on this drawer front. And if you do that, if you put your front drawer panel with the sides going into the front, or the front overlapping the sides there, eventually that front panel can start to loosen up or can even pull out and completely destroy your drawer. So that's a really important part of drawer building that you need to understand. Now here comes everybody's favorite part of using drawer slides, is putting that drawer in for the first time and making sure that everything fits well. An important thing about these side mount drawer slides, it's going to be tight. You can see here that first push in is usually very tight. Usually the first one or two feels a little tight. However, you should see that it loosens up over time. If it doesn't, you've got a problem. You need to adjust something. Now that the drawers are all installed, let's mill some lumber up here so I can make my drawer faces. Now I know, YouTube stereotype, who's really using walnut in their shop, yada, yada, yada. I love walnut, just like a lot of people do. And I had some laying around. There's some other stuff that I build that I buy a lot of common walnut for. So I had some extra, and it adds to my enjoyment in the shop. So I'm going to use walnut on this. You can obviously use plywood. You can use any cheaper wood you want. This is what I had. This is what I like, and it matches my miter station, so I'm going with it. So I got everything milled to width and to height. And what you'll see here is I'm pre-drilling. I used a jig to go ahead and mark the locations for my drawer pulls. And for me, this is an important part, again, of the drawer building process. And you'll see what I mean here in a minute. I always pre-drill those handle holes, and then I have started using playing cards for shims. You can really make it accurate and specific. It's an easy way to shim things to make sure you've got even spacing. So with this first drawer, I use my shims to get my offset from the base and the sides, and then I take some screws and I screw them in through the holes that I just drilled for the handle itself. Now this attaches it to the face, and then I can come from the inside, screw from inside of there, and put a couple screws in. Now my face is nice and attached and I'm good to go. Once I get both of those screws in, I go ahead and push the drawer back in, and now I can take the two screws that I initially put in to temporarily hold the face onto the drawer front out. I'm going to go ahead and drill through so that I get drilled through all the rest of the way through both the drawer face and the front panel of the drawer. That way I can then next get my handle, pass the screws through there, screw my handle in, and voila, you've got a really easy way to put drawers in, an easy way to get the faces of your drawers spaced the way that you want them. It's a really nice process. This is what I've used for all the drawers I've built. I originally saw this from Mark Spagnolo, the Wood Whisperer. As with everything with woodworking, there's tons of other ways to do this. There's jigs you can buy that clamp the face on, but this is the way that I prefer to do it. Now I have this one drawer that's above my dust extractor, and for this one, the spacing that's most important is not only the spacing on the sides, but the spacing on the top. I want that spacing on the top to match the spacing on the top of the drawers in the left bank. So I put my playing cards as shims up above. This one, I just eyeballed my spaces, got it pretty good, and then went through the same exact process that I just described to you. All of the drawers on the left side are the exact same size. This one is a little bit oversized. I had a few specific things that were a little bit bigger that I wanted to store in there, so I made that one oversized versus making multiple small ones. And of course, the last step, went ahead and put all the handles on, and you can see pretty nice result, I think. All right, guys, well, that is going to do it for part 2 here. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, comment below, let me know what you think, comments, questions you have. I'd love to hear from you and get back to you about them. Now in part 3, we're going to cover how I built this top. It's a 3/4 inch MDF top with black laminate. 2/3 of it is covered in MFT style dog holes, and it's affixed to the base of the cabinets with 80/20 aluminum extrusion. I'm also going to let you know the pros and cons and what I would have done differently if I had to build this all over again, having worked with this for a few months now. So, should be exciting. Please check back in with us, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you know when we got future videos coming out. Thanks for watching, and until next time, get out there and enjoy your garage.